talk about clinical research and why we need diversity among research volunteers. We first have to look at the definition of health equity. And here is an abbreviated version stating health equity means that everyone has a fair and just chance to be as healthy as possible. And I would actually push on that and say that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible and to maintain that health. And so when you think about clinical trials and the potential benefits of clinical trials, ensuring diversity in research is one of the key ways that we can also help to strive towards achieving health equity. And so having diverse groups provides us confidence that any results that we're learning from clinical trials, any findings, they actually apply to a wide range of people and not just those who were not all of the people who are actually represented on the trial. And then it helps ensure that everyone can get the treatment that is best for them. And of course, without being on the trials, we don't know if it is best for all of the groups that are not represented. And so in looking at who is actually on the clinical trials, and this is across the nation, again, you see these patterns or these numbers, these proportions, across different clinical conditions for different drug trials, treatment trials, et cetera. And if you look at the chart on the right, you'll notice that this shows us who by race ethnicity is represented on the average on clinical trials. And you'll see an overwhelming, in fact, the majority of participants are Caucasian or white participants or other. And so that's 94%, compared to 5%, which is a lot smaller, of Black or African American patients, and then a mere 1% of Hispanic Latino populations. And then on the left, just to make a comparison, that's the demographic makeup of the same groups within the United States. So you'll see about 72% of the United States population are Caucasian, and then 12% are African American, and then 16% of those participants, or the population, excuse me, are Hispanic or Latino. So again, looking at the two side by side, you see that there's a really gross underrepresentation of these racial ethnic minority groups on clinical trials, and that should be really, really concerning to all of us, especially those from these groups, considering the fact that if our trial makeup doesn't reflect what our actually countries make up, that's a real concern for the populations who aren't represented on trials, especially when we think about the opportunity to benefit from what we learn from science, what we learn from the research, and most important, the treatments that we're developing from these studies. And so in addition to making sure that the treatments work just as well for everyone by having representation on the trials, there are a lot of different factors that we have the opportunity to learn when we do have diverse research volunteers and participants. So there's factors such as a person's age. We need to understand what range of side effects come with what range of ages. So we have to have representation from all age groups on those trials. New drugs may very well interact with any number of medications or medicines that a person's taking. However, if we don't have those people on the trials, we don't have the opportunity to learn what interactions, what safety issues there might be. In addition to that, we know that there is genetic variation among all populations and among diverse participants. And so without that diversity in research volunteers, we don't have the opportunity to understand how genetic interactions or how people's medicine or how their genes respond to a certain medicine. And ultimately, and the piece that I always like to highlight is given clinical trials are really the key to giving people access to the newest medical treatments. And in the field that I started this work in oncology, we really saw major advances and improved outcomes for participants based on their willingness to participate in clinical trials and try new therapies. And so there are plenty of documented reasons. For years now, this work has been done in terms of why people are not included in research that are diverse and representative of the population. There are plenty of documented reasons both on the patient side and on the provider side. And there are also a lot of documented reasons on the institution side. And we sort of know what these are. And I'll touch on a quick few on the patient side in terms of the study I'll present. And then there are a lot of known provider barriers that are talked about. So for instance, the lack of diversity in research can also actually be because of the researcher's own biases, whether it's how the trials are designed, things like inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then also just personal biases in terms of who is even offered a clinical trial sometimes by a provider. And those are things that I think are not talked about as much. So for example, and we have here, a researcher may think, based on their own biases, that a person with a disability or a person who's differently abled cannot take part in a research study. And the fact of the matter is that it's actually the complete opposite, in that we have to make steps to make sure that people with disabilities can access research in the same way as others. And then this idea that researchers have to also recognize, and again, along the lines of these biases, that people express their gender in different ways. And so understanding what that means in terms of their eligibility for a trial and what may be right for them. And so in thinking about clinical trials and representation, on the next slide, please, the question is, all that said, is it important to include diverse groups in COVID-19 studies? So the very right now issue of the hour, and the answer is yes, absolutely, of course it is. The COVID-19 virus clearly does not discriminate in terms of who it infects if there is an exposure. It's true that there are structural and other factors that make some groups clearly more susceptible, and disproportionately so, we know, racial and ethnic minorities and other minoritized groups. However, having that diverse group of research volunteers, especially for something that is so salient and that is, at the core of our existence right now, really can help make sure that those very same groups that are overwhelmingly impacted also stand to benefit by being part of these trials. And so ensuring that the results from any current COVID-19 studies, vaccine studies, apply to as many people as possible.